Welcome to the Azure podcast. This is episode 454, being recorded on February the 22nd, 2023. I'm Russell Young, and with me is Kendall, and our special guest today, going to talk about sustainability in the cloud, is Paul Henwood. But before we come on to introduce Paul, we just want to go over some of the current updates that we've seen in the past few weeks on Azure that have kind of caught our eye. Kendall, I know you were talking about the ACS, Azure Communication Services bot one. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I've always been a huge fan, over my career of bot framework and the work that Microsoft did around Azure Bot Service and just basically enabling organizations to build bots that can interact, whether it's via chat or, even just, communication. And so it's been really neat to see how that's evolved over time, how it's become more accessible to more and more broadly available to developers. And so one of the things that's in public preview that was announced on February 15th is basically bot framework integration with Azure Communication Services chat. So essentially what this means is if you're building like conversational, that's what I was looking for. If you're building a conversational bot using Azure Bot Service, you can actually then streamline the handover to Azure Communication Services chat, which essentially allows for you to translate, maybe first line of defense, which is the bot running, maybe the conversational bot running on Azure Bot Service, and then essentially translate that into chat-based communication using communication services. So obviously this helps a lot if a bot can essentially greet the customer, and then maybe as things escalate, or if they need to be handled by, a real agent, you can do a handoff there. You can also basically meet customers outside of business hours because you're offloading some of the responsibility to bot service and communication services, and then also integrate with AI to kind of understand sentiment and also to push notifications to mobile devices, things of that nature. So I think it's really interesting. We'll drop the links in the show notes, but just seeing the collaboration between, Azure Communication Services, which is a really powerful service, and now seeing how that's working together with the growth of our bot services platform it's really cool to see, and definitely creates a good end-to-end experience, especially for customer service scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought that's a very common scenario, isn't it? That bit of doing that first contact, taking some context from the customer, and then wanting to hand over to an agent or taking the message and asking them to call back if busy and whatever you say. Yeah, it's good to see that one. Thank you. One that caught my eye was the general availability of the Azure Data Explorer dashboards. And I was having a chat with Paul about this a little bit earlier because Paul's quite a Power BI guru, and I was kind of like questioning where this fitted versus Power BI, but Azure Data Explorer, obviously based on the kind of Custo data sets and KQL queries and stuff like that. So for querying a lot more of that operational streaming log analytical type data. So this feature now lets you create interactive dashboards that you can share more broadly, and then let the person that's consuming that explore and carry on their exploration journey using more KQL or using that ADX web UI. So that sounds quite a good thing. I'm going to have a play with that later on, I think. Azure Backup has got some enhanced experience features for creating and managing private endpoints. So you've got the ability now to create private endpoints without managed identities within Azure Backup, using fewer private IPs per vault as well. So this is all part of the recovery services vault thing. You don't need to create separate private endpoints for blob and queue services like you did before. So some extra bits come on there. And finally, there was a stream of a few updates to Azure SQL that went GA mid-February, including some optimization on how the locking works to improve database concurrency and lowering the amount of memory needed for locking in Azure SQL. Automatic key rotation for customer managed keys in both Azure SQL MI and Azure SQL Database, and the ability to configure your TempDB maximum size in Azure SQL Managed Instance, which wasn't there before as well. So there was a load of updates to choose from as well. So if you haven't checked in a while, go back and check the blog site as well. But yeah, time to hand over to intro Paul. I've known Paul for quite a few years, so I knew Paul before he joined Microsoft as well, actually. But for the last sort of 8 years maybe, he's been working fairly closely with me at Microsoft as well. So Yeah, Paul, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks. So yeah, my name's Paul Henwood. I'm a cloud solution architect in the partner side of the business at Microsoft, specializing in data and sustainability. So really my passion, especially over the last sort of 9-12 months, has been working with as many partners as possible to help them with their sustainability journey. So thinking about how they can work and use Azure, but also help customers obviously reduce the amount of carbon, waste, water, etc. However I can really help them. It's just a really passionate area for me. So when Russell offered me the chance to come and talk about it, I'm always keen to say yes to anyone who lets me talk about sustainability.
Yeah, I think I really kind of, reflecting on your journey coming into Microsoft and with all the kind of data and analytical background that you've got and that ability to analyze and do business information, but then you've focused on sustainability as that passion area. Combining the two things really brings out a lot of interesting insight and information. So that, I'm really, really keen to hear what you've got to tell us about sustainability in Azure. I know there's the cloud for sustainability. There's all the stuff going on with Azure data centers and how they support sustainability and how they're making themselves become more sustainable as well. So lots of different aspects to this as well.
Yeah, so I thought it would be worth starting talking a little bit about the cloud for sustainability. It's something that a lot of people have perhaps heard about, and maybe it's not clear kind of what it is and how it fits together. So I thought it might be nice for me to just maybe give a little bit of an overview, talk about it, and talk about kind of some of the core products that we've got in that space as a starter.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
So the cloud for sustainability, really, it's a collection of both the Microsoft first-party products, but also some of our partner offerings as well. So when you kind of see the cloud for sustainability, some people will talk about tools like Microsoft Sustainability Manager or the Emissions Impact Dashboard. All of these tools are just part of the overall cloud for sustainability. So really, you can just think of a collection of everything sustainability related when it comes to Microsoft. And this is things like the common data model. We've got a common data model specifically for sustainability. And that's really about helping have that single definition or that single setup of data that you can pull data from lots of different locations for all different types of carbon, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, for water, for waste, and you can centralize that all onto a common data model. And the benefit of having that common data model is then being able to have a number of Microsoft first-party products that leverage it, but also partner products and offerings that leverage it as well. So it's really about having both of us being able to build offerings in that space. So when it comes to kind of Microsoft offerings, the main things are the Microsoft Sustainability Manager might be the tool that people have heard about, which is a tool which is aimed at basically carbon accounting to start with the viewpoint that you can get an idea of where you are as a business and actually be able to collate data for every different scope, that's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, so emissions related to electricity or business travel or purchase goods and services, and being able to pull it all into a centralized tool and automate all of the calculations. That's kind of the main first-party tool that a lot of people will hear about.
So this isn't just about their consumption of compute and resources within Azure, it's about the consumption of their business as a whole. And does it cover their supply chain as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really about thinking of an individual organization. So if we take Microsoft, we actually use the Microsoft Sustainability Manager to measure our own carbon emissions. So this will be things like our actual direct emissions. So our scope 1, our indirect emissions, things like electricity, and scope 2, and then scope 3, as Russell, as you said there, it's the supply chain as well, both upstream and downstream. It's about business travel, what purchase goods I've got. So really, it's about you as an organization being able to provision the tool and report on what your carbon impact is as an organization. And then in the future, be able to report on where you are from a waste and a water perspective as well. So that's kind of the main first-party product we've got.
That sounds like a lot of work to put all that data in there. Is it quite onerous?
The challenges around for a lot of organizations is finding that data and having access to that data, right? So I think that's often where organizations have that challenge. It's a very manual process that people are doing today, but as more regulatory requirements come in, especially Europe and America, we're talking the next 1-2 years, there's actually going to be a lot more requirements to have to actually report on this information. So like I say, a lot of the largest organizations are doing it today already, but it's very manual. It takes months, data to pull from lots of different locations. So really it's about helping reduce that effort to actually configure it all. Because once you've configured it, it's there, it's ready, it's refreshing regularly, and you've got access to that data. So.
And is that, sorry, Kendall.
No, it's okay, go ahead.
I was just wondering what the output of it is. Is it in terms of tons of carbon, or is it recommendations, or?
Yeah, so the main part of it is being able to have that centralized unit of measure. So metric tons CO2 equivalent is the typical way that you do it. So you're converting all of these electricity in kilowatt hours, the purchased goods in dollars or pounds, and you're converting it all to this single unit. So you know as a business that I'm generating this much CO2, with really the plan that you can then configure goals to think about how I can reduce that overall emissions and how I can actually think about what I'm generating as a business and how I can reduce it.
So this is my ignorance showing, because this really is like, I'm very I'm very uneducated in this area, but I'm curious. So is a lot of the data that these customers are looking for like actually coming off of like IoT devices from legitimate potentially like operating machines, and like is that kind of the source of a lot of this data that they're actually bringing in? And is it coming off of like physical hardware that's potentially running their business, or?
Yeah, so there's a few ways that you can measure those sorts of things, right? So if you think about the running of a particular office, just start with that for as an example, you could pull things like meter readings, right? Or you could pull from the actual data that's being generated by particular rooms, if you've kind of got IoT devices down to that level. Or of course, you could do it by literally pulling your electricity bill, right? Which at the end of the month, you could have a PDF that says I've generated or spent 1,000 kilowatts in electricity. We will get them at home, right? So you can use those as a measure. So there's a number of different ways that you can do it, depending on how you want to plan and analyze and reduce your overall emissions, right? There's lots of ways that you can think about it, but that's just one example, right? Some other data, things like business travel, that's going to be the number of miles that are being traveled by an individual, and so what's the responsibility for an individual cost center, thinking about how maybe they're traveling 1,000 miles a year and they need to think really about how they can reduce that impact. It's being able to equate that to a number and then being able to start coming up with those plans around how can you reduce it by, in that case, maybe moving some conversations to Teams rather than in person. Or if you're thinking about maybe making the electricity that's generated by any data centers that you're running your applications in, thinking about could I migrate those to the cloud and therefore benefit from some of the kind of cloud scale computes and some of the implementations and benefits we've got in Azure to really reduce your overall impact.
So I have a follow-up question, if that's okay, Russell. And this one might be a little bit out there, because once again, I'm asking what's on my like novice mindset. But so obviously Azure, we as a company, or Microsoft as a company, is working to reduce our own carbon footprint and be carbon neutral in a lot of these different efforts. So obviously the workloads of all of our customers that are running on Azure is the aggregation of that is ultimately what we're responsible for also decreasing. So subsequently, I would assume we're also somewhat reducing that for our customers. So I'm kind of curious, is there, obviously with some of these other data points, like, your electricity within a particular office location or something like that, that's obviously one bucket of data that like we aren't necessarily going to have unless it's brought to us. But we clearly know like how many VMs is this customer running, or so do we have a way within the tool of kind of automating at least the like, here's how much your infrastructure / Azure operations is contributing to these different factors? Like, is that part automated in that tool or accessible in another area?
Absolutely. And I promised people we didn't plant this question, but actually one of the other parts of the Cloud for Sustainability is the emissions impact dashboard. And what that does is allows an organization to basically install an application in Power BI, and it will tell you what your emissions are for your Azure resources that you're using. So you'll be able to drill into it. You'll be able to see, right, as an organization, I'm generating this much carbon. How much is this subscription generating in this region over this time frame? So as an organization, we actually make that data available via what we call the emissions impact dashboard, and that's available both for your Azure usage and your Microsoft 365 usage as well. So you can see what the use of our services is generating from a carbon perspective for you. Because what you need to think about as an organization is the emissions generated by Microsoft are still emissions that you're responsible for by using our services. In this case, let's take organization, just one of our customers. They would be looking at their scope 1 category, scope 3 category 1, which is basically purchased goods. They've purchased Azure, right? And therefore the emissions generated by the use of Azure is going to be part of their emissions that they need to report on.
And those values must vary by data center and location, I would have thought as well, because
they do. Yeah. So in our data centers, we have different. Obviously, data centers are built all the time, right? We're constantly building, upgrading, and improving our data centers in lots of different ways. If we take some of the newer data centers, for example, things like data center in Sweden, there's lots of investments that we have there where that data center will potentially have a lower PUE. You might hear it referred to, which is the power usage efficiency. And this will basically mean that certain data centers will run slightly more efficiently, with the viewpoint, obviously, we're looking to make all of our data centers as efficiently as possible. But yes, there will be some slight variation between them due to the different generations of data centers that we have. So if we take the Swedish one, for example, which is very new, we've got things like rainwater capture inside the data center. So we're reducing the amount of water that's actually being used to like in the data center itself. In fact, most of the cooling is actually air cooling rather than water cooling. So we're trying to also reduce the impact we're having on water usage in a particular region. And then from the carbon perspective, we're using 100% carbon-free energy. And we're also got investments in things like the Preem Evolution diesel fuel, which is a 50% it's a low carbon renewable fuel, effectively that's used for our backup generators. So there's lots of ways that we've got in our newer data centers to really help with the overall reduction or the overall emissions that are generated. Like I say, not just from carbon. I kind of mentioned some of the water and waste pieces there as well. Or waste, actually, I didn't mention. That's the recycling center. So we have recycling centers on site in our data centers. We're actually adding it to all of our data centers. So 80% of the components can actually be recycled on site. So they don't need to be disposed of or transported somewhere else. We can recycle and reuse them on site within the data centers themselves. So I started by talking about carbon, but really we need to think about as a whole here, we need to think about our waste, we need to think about the water that's being consumed, and really all up how much we're impact we're putting onto the environment.
That's really, yeah, there's a lot to think about, isn't there? And is there, I mean, when I'm having conversations with customers, how can we kind of quantify what saving they'll be making in terms of sustainable savings when they move to the cloud? Is it ever been is it ever a close call, or is it actually, no, you move to any public cloud and you're going to make a big impact in terms of your sustainability footprint?
I think it's pretty safe to say that in all cases, if you move to a public cloud, there's going to be a lot more efficiencies from scale by actually migrating. If you look at things like the emissions impact dashboard that I mentioned, it actually compares the use of Azure versus what an on-premises equivalent would be, and depending on the efficiency of a data center that you're using, this could be anywhere from maybe a 60% efficiency, anywhere to something like 93% more efficient by moving to the cloud if you're really using single servers or things like that, if you're not using VMs, or if you're in a very small using a very small data center that's obviously not using renewable energy and things like that. So when we actually migrated to the cloud, Microsoft obviously have been doing this for many years, but when we migrated all of our services, we actually saw a 98% reduction overall in our carbon usage. But really on average we're talking about like a 93 sort of percent efficiency, and yeah.
So I'm curious, I assume that there's, a ton of different motivations for wanting to become more sustainable, but I'm hypothesizing here that maybe two of the main factors are one, regulatory requirements, right? There's honestly just hey, we have a motivation or a requirement to kind of become more sustainable. And then obviously companies that are just trying to be more environmentally conscientious, right? Trying to make sure, and because I feel like that's also something that some of their customers care about as well. So it's kind of a, we feel, maybe a moral or, environmental obligation to do our part. And also we know that our customers, potentially also care about these things. And this is something that can be used from a marketing perspective. So I'm curious, if you're in one of those camps, which I assume those are, maybe two of the main buckets, and would be curious if if you see that as also being the reality, or if there's also some other, main motivations to start driving this. But do customers just go into the Azure portal and like deploy a resource, or since it is sort of like its own cloud, because I'm thinking, like the Gov cloud, and then I'm thinking of like just Azure Public. I'm wondering, because it has its own, cloud-based, schema, the cloud for sustainability, is it a suite of products that has to be opted into in a different way than just like piecemealing various Azure resources?
Okay, so I'll start with some of the motivation pieces. And you're right, by the way, from the regulatory requirement and the customer request, but there's a few more as well. There's actually investor expectation as well, right? You've got to think organizations, or it's kind of driven by the customer as well, right? But investors are wanting to make sure that they're investing in organizations that are thinking about sustainability, or thinking about what we hear ESG. So I've been focusing on the environmental part, but you've got the social and the governance aspects as well. So it's really investors are actually driving it too. And then you've also got overall cost reductions as well. So some organizations maybe have very high energy costs from actually running some of these data centers. So maybe there's a monetary motivation that goes alongside the sustainability benefit that it drives to actually do so. And in some cases, there's also an economic opportunity as well. If we think about some partners and some capabilities and offerings that can be built to help people plan on how to reduce their overall emissions, there are lots of opportunities to go after as well for our customers and our partners around reducing it. So you're right with the kind of, I guess, the main two, but there are a few others that kind of lean into that as well. In terms of how people get started and thinking about it, Sustainability Manager is around reporting where you are as an organization, right? So that gives you that baseline. So I'm generating this much. You can then start thinking about goals and plans. You can think, right, can I electrify my fleet? Can I reduce my overall emissions in my particular buildings? Can I reduce the amount of travel that I've got for my employees? There's various different mechanisms and schemes, and you'll see lots of great offerings from our partners that will help provide that guidance. Some of them might be more specific, like switching out how you're getting electricity, or moving your data centers to another location. There can be lots of ways that you do it, but it's really thinking about where you are today, and then how you can reduce. From an Azure perspective, it's really thinking about when you are using the cloud, migrating services from on-premises or from existing data centers into the cloud should often give you a reduction in overall emissions, right? There are actually offerings that we have in Microsoft. We have what's called a sustainability solution assessment, where we can actually give you that guidance around the sorts of savings you would make from a sustainability perspective, from a carbon perspective, if you were to migrate to the cloud. And some of our partners have similar offerings as well. But it's not just, let's just shove it in the cloud, right? That's also not going to fully solve the problem. The same kind of pattern where we say you can lift and shift and move on to IaaS, but there are often more efficient services and uses of our PaaS and SaaS offerings, which means that you can reduce your overall emissions. And this is why we have things like the well-architected framework for sustainability, where you start thinking about, how do I design something in Azure but think about sustainability when I'm designing it? So you'll see things like I said, the well-architected framework for sustainability, green software principles people may hear about as well. So there's a few different kind of patterns that are trying to provide that guidance to people, but that's really a consideration. Just like moving in the cloud, you want to keep the cost as low as possible. Let's also think about keeping that energy use as low as possible by designing efficiently at the same time.
I suppose
sorry. I was just gonna.
Yeah, go on.
Go ahead. No, I was just gonna add. So, but like, I guess that all makes sense and that's helpful. But like, for example, like if I'm in Azure and I want access to these sustainability tools, is it just a resource I deploy, or like, do I buy a license? Like, right. How would I actually get access to the crux of the management dashboard, for example, that you mentioned? So
the emissions impact dashboard, which tells you what your overall emissions generated by the Azure services, is something you can just download in Power BI. So you need a Power BI Pro license as an individual, but once you download the data in there, that's it. It's just ready for you to use, and it will continue to update. If you want to use Sustainability Manager to report on your overall organization's carbon being produced, that is a licensed product that you would need to purchase. It's part of our Dynamics suite that you can deploy deploy. And so you would be able to purchase and provision that tool separately. But for anyone who's using Azure today, I would be recommending getting to the emissions impact dashboard and have a look at where you are today. Would be a great place to get started.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that even if you don't care about sustainability and the planet, you do care about cost. Usually, most companies do, and the two things go hand in hand together. So why would you not? Particularly when you're killing two birds with one stone.
And that's why it's worth having a little look at the well-architected framework for sustainability, because whilst the cost and sustainability do go hand in hand, there are times where you may have other things you need to balance. So obviously when you're designing an all-up solution, you've got to think about high availability, disaster recovery, and things like that. So there are trade-offs to be had between the when you're designing the application between these different areas. So it is something that you do need to consider, and hopefully people are already looking at well architected today. And if they haven't seen the new sustainability pillar, I would say check it out. And there's even more recently, there's an assessment tool that you can go through as well, so you can fill in the assessment for the sustainability pillar too, if you're wanting to evaluate one of your solutions. That would really help you.
Cool. And you mentioned, ongoing development and the fact that these data centers are going through different generations to constantly upgrade and what have you. We heard about Project Natic, I think it was called, where they're submerging data centers offshore. I think partly was due to testing cooling things, but also testing whether you can relocate. What else is going on in those sort of areas that you know about?
Yeah, so the Project Natic stuff is around deploying closer to a location, right? So there are benefits, as you said, around the overall power usage efficiency. This is where when we talk about this, we're talking it's actually 1.07 or less PUE. So it's very low in terms of the amounts of energy that are generated, as you've highlighted, kind of the reduced amount of cooling that's actually required. There's also other benefits like resistance to hurricanes and storms and all of those sorts of things as well. So there's some other benefits that you get alongside it. But yeah, Natic's a really interesting one. Some of the other ones around this space are around things like, how is data stored? You've got to think data being stored on lots of different servers, often in triplicate, or let's be honest, people are not actually deleting all the old images on their phones or all of their old emails, etc. So the amount of data that's being stored in the cloud is constantly increasing, right? We're all generating it, and let's be honest, no one's really removing it, even personally, let alone thinking about businesses. So how we store that data, there's lots of efficiencies that can be done around that space as well. So there are things like research into storing data on quartz glass, or even actually using DNA to store data. I mean, the DNA storage is looking like it could be around a 60% efficiency in terms of emissions that are generated and the water that's being consumed for cooling as well. So that's one of the ones that I think is super interesting. Still one that I need to look more into and get a lot more detail, but it sounds super cool. And yeah, the fact that it's got those benefits of kind of huge reductions is pretty good.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can get my head around that.
I'm not sure I've got my head fully around it either, if I'm being honest. The other ones are Project Xerix, which is thinking about building a modern data center. You'll see lots of things in the news and lots of comments around the fact that it generates a lot of emissions to actually build a data center, right? We're building a big concrete building, right? And everyone knows that there's a lot of emissions generated in processes like that. We call it embodied carbon, right? The amount of carbon that's generated by actually producing the building. So it's thinking about, rather than using things like steel, concrete, plastics, the typical things that you would build, is thinking about how can we use other types of materials to be more efficient and reduce the amount of impact. So this is things like bricks made of algae. There are mushroom compounds for electricity circuits. There's earthen slabs, and there's use of timber a lot more, which is significantly lower emissions. So there's lots of things, researchers in that space, to use these alternate materials to try and reduce the impact of building all of these data centers. I mean, I don't know if people have seen recently the BBC Panorama episode talking about data centers and the impacts in some areas. And so part of what we're trying to do is not just reduce the amount of water that's being used, use renewable energy, offset to make sure whenever we're using a carbon generating piece or for carbon piece of energy or carbon generated piece of energy, that we offset that exact amount on the grid to make sure that there's a renewable energy electron for each one that we're using available on the grid. Things like that. There's lots of things that we're doing in that space that I think people hear about, but there's all this research is going to help, right, in terms of all of these areas. And there are some probably easier ones to understand. I probably could have started with things like some of the liquid immersion cooling. So rather than using water cooling, which is the typical, or air cooling where possible, which is even better, right, because it doesn't have a stress on water basins, but using things like liquid immersion cooling. So actually putting the circuit boards inside a liquid, so it's immediately dissipating heat a lot more easily to reduce the overall cooling that's required. You've got things like grid interactive UPS batteries. So these are being able to take renewable energy off of the grid for these backup batteries, and more efficient, clean backup power. I mentioned some of the kind of renewable diesels or partial renewable diesel fuels. There's various different ways that we're doing that. So lots of different things beyond, let's say, the obvious of just reduce water and use renewable energy that's actually happening to help with our overall impact of these data centers.
Yeah, I was quite amazed at how unbalanced some of the press has been in terms of it's a big data center, it's bad for the environment, without considering all the research that goes into making these things better, and the fact that it's replacing something that's even worse in most cases as well. But on the flip side, I can blame Cal as well because of all the crypto blockchain mining technology that he uses and supported over the years for that. So this has been really interesting. Thank you very much, Paul, for coming on and talking about all this. Are there any kind of final thoughts or calls to action for people?
I think so. The call to action from me, at least, again, this is kind of my passion area, right? So my call to action for all organizations is really start thinking about where you are as an organization. Obviously, as a Microsoft employee, I'd say, yeah, great, use all the Microsoft technologies, but as an individual, I would say, please just start reporting on where you are, whether you use the Microsoft tool or other tools. Make sure you know where you are as an organization and really start to plan and reduce your overall emissions. That's a personal ask, I would say. And then if you are going to use Azure services, use the emissions impact dashboard so you know the impact of what you're doing. Look at the green software principles and the well-architected to build more efficient, more sustainable designed solutions. And make sure it's part of conversations that you're having and considerations when designing applications. We need to stop it being that secondary or afterthought. It needs to more be a forethought, and it needs to be thought up front, similar to how people think about costs today, right? I need to think about how much it's going to cost up front. What's my impact up front? Let's think about that, and let's make sure we're considering.
Yeah, absolutely. It should be part of every business case, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I did a there's a course and a badge that you can do that Microsoft created, I think, called Sustainability in Action. I think that's available to general public to consume and use as well, which kind of gives you quite a good broad education in terms of all those different scopes and how sustainability can be framed, measured, calculated, and acted upon as well. So,
and there's lots of ways you can get involved, and you'll see there's lots of materials to learn and read. You don't have to read everything and learn everything at once, right? For me, the journey will start with carbon, right? It's probably the easier one to get your head around. How much am I generating? Can I make that number smaller? It's a very simple place to start, and just a great place to start reading more and learning more. And then obviously broader than that, think about maybe kind of ESG as a whole, and the 17 UN sustainability goals would be kind of the final place to go.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, it's been great having you on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. This was great.